Hey everybody, welcome to week 7, I think, Judicial Branch Week. We're halfway through section 2 of this course, and by the way, I'm a bit sick, so bear with me with the sniffles and maybe coughs throughout the lecture today. This fall semester, it's always like that. Always gets everybody. So let's get going. Let's talk about the judicial branch, the third and final of our 3 branches of government, and wrap up section 2 of this course. So, what are our learning objectives? First off, we want to make sure we understand what the overall structure of our federal court system is. We understand it as a 3-tiered system. We'll explore briefly. We also want to interpret the difference between the state and federal level of our courts and who has certain responsibilities within each entity. Explain how and who appoints judges on both the federal and the state level, although the state level does vary by state, although we can identify some general commonalities between most states, and understand how we appoint state judges in Montana. Also, identify the ideological makeup of our current Supreme Court and examine some of its current rulings, primarily some notable landmark rulings, some of which that are a bit inflammatory in a contemporary debate, but it is essential that we have objective foundations to these rulings on a government level. Of course, remember, we're not here to talk about politics, we're here to talk about government. We're going to realize what these landmark decisions are and what they entail and how they can be changed. And we're going to distinguish the checks the other branches have on the judicial. So let's get going. So first off, our 3-tiered court system. Of course, we remember, think of it as a pyramid. I have a visualization in the next slide, but at the bottom, the lower courts, much larger. You have more judges. The district, that is the first court you would engage with if you were involved in any federal offenses. Then you would have the second court, which is the circuit court, often referred to as the appellate courts. This is where you have appeals. You have panels of 3 judges presiding each case, and they must come to a general consensus. 2 out of 3, that's a majority. And then beyond that, if your case was pivotal and foundational and results in a nuance and interpretation of our laws, you would finally reach the Supreme Court. This is the final and highest court in the United States. Any ruling provided by the Supreme Court can only be overturned, in a sense, by a future ruling provided by the exact same body, the Supreme Court. So we will look at the Supreme Court in detail in a few slides, but overview, we must remember that there are 3 tiers to our federal court system. Just under 900 judges. We don't have to remember the specifics of how many judges, excluding how many judges are in the Supreme Court, which we have 9 justices, as they are referred to. Within our district court, we have about 94 district courts, a little over 600 judges, but you do see 1 judge per case. Essential to remember that. This is where you do have the traditional trials, as you would know. And then you see the 12 federal circuit courts. This is where you would see a panel of 3 judges operating and running each individual case. Any trial that goes to the appeals court, excluding certain specific cases, would have already gone through the district court. And same with the Supreme. Any case reaching the Supreme Court, almost guaranteed, unless there was an accelerated process for certain issues that some relate to the executive, as you've seen in recent years, specifically recent months. You'll see those fast-tracked. But traditionally, we do see that any Supreme Court case, especially one that might revolve around any traditional citizens' issues, they would have met the circuit and district courts prior. So here's a visualization. You can see here the 3-tiered system, U.S. district courts at the bottom, Court of Appeals, circuit courts there, that second tier, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. You also see those side courts, I guess you could say. That's not what they would be referred to in our government, but in the visualization we can see it as that. The U.S. Claims Court, Court of International Trade, and these are just some examples of the courts that might sidestep the traditional stepping up the ladder process within our court system. So, what is the difference between state and federal courts? For one, the state level and the federal level have different origins of authority. They have different appointments, different individuals making appointments to these bodies. Now, the state, of course, there is nuance with this uh, with the way that state judges obtain their post, as some do this through elections, that like in the state of Montana, we elect our state judges. Others rely on appointments made by the governor, and some with checks and balance systems similar to our federal government, some without. So state federal courts have judges appointed by governors or selected through nonpartisan elections. And when they interpret cases, apologies, they rely on state constitutions and state legislation. We briefly mentioned this at the beginning, but we have to understand that our Constitution is not the only Constitution that exists in the world, let alone our own nation. We have state constitutions for every single state. Montana has a unique state constitution that was, well, we see multiple states re-examine their constitutions and ratify new constitutions here and there throughout U.S. history. The Montana Constitution was ratified in the 1970s and actually allows for one of the most unique interpretations of a state constitution, as it has a sentiment in the beginning, in the preamble, focusing on, I think it was something about a right to a clean environment to its citizens, which has been the basis for a state Supreme Court ruling on the environment and certain drilling and I don't know if it was drilling or forestry rights, but harvesting of the land was restricted on the basis of that segment of the state constitution. A great example of how, for one, our judges on the state level rely on the state legislation and constitutions to make uh, policy interpretations, and these judges are unique within each state. Now, when we look at the federal level, these judges are appointed by the president and then, of course, approved by the Senate. This is a process we've already discussed in previous lectures. Remember, the appointment powers granted to the president, numerous positions, and many of those include federal judges. And of course, we do know that you need the Senate approval for federal judges. Now, will we remember the period in which there was a significant use of the filibuster to prevent federal judges from getting appointed during the around 2010, which resulted in the nuclear option being utilized by Harry Reid, which then resulted in only a simple majority needed for federal judges. And now we see a similar practice occurring for Supreme Court justices. So we have sped up the appointment process in recent years regarding federal judges. Not going to be quizzed, not a focus of the class, but conversational, neat detail. And that started as early as 2008. So we also know that federal judges cannot interpret certain rulings based off of state laws or legislation. We do know that they have to exclusively rely on federal law and the federal constitution. And that is how you see their check on other branches. As I mentioned in previous lectures, remember, they determine the constitutionality of legislation. They will look at federal law and the federal constitution to determine if certain actions, procedures, or legislation, even in certain circumstances, is constitutional and aligns with the general interpretation of our guiding documents. Now, when we talk about the state and federal courts, we have to understand that there are both civil and criminal courts on both levels. So first, what is the difference? You may have briefly heard of this difference, but let's make sure we have a concrete understanding. First off, a civil case is one where there are legal disputes between individuals or entities. Think of I'm gonna sue you. That's a civil case right there. You have this often regards civil liberties, civil rights, obligations, not civil liberties, civil rights, regards obligations or liabilities, often involves compensation. We saw variations of civil cases that result in breaking up of companies, even. You'll have breaking up of certain, I wouldn't say breaking up, you'll have punishments that include fees, damages, distribution of resources and goods, or specific performances that vary based off of the case. This is where some would argue you may have a little unusual punishment sorry, I have crazy cats, as you know, but civil cases primarily regarding individual disputes solved through our court system. You think of breach of contract, personal injury, property disputes, family law issues, divorce, many issues like that. And it is worth noting in civil cases, you have a notably lower burden of proof. I'll use an example in just a moment to illustrate that. But first, criminal cases. These are cases where you have a legal proceeding brought by the government against an individual or entity accused of violating laws, both federal or state laws. And of course, if a criminal case is brought forward on a state by a state judge or a federal judge, of course, you understand that that would relate to either a state violation or a federal violation. Now, this is where you would see punishments like incarcerations. Still, you would have fines, but far less likely, and that would only be for misdemeanors and lower crimes of that sort. Probation, community service is a common punishment for these kind of cases. And we also see some examples that we would all be able to visualize and understand: murder, theft, assault, things of that nature. Now, I always use this example when helping understand the difference between these cases. And of course, with each year, it becomes a little more outdated. But if you remember the 1990s, that big inflammatory case that caught the nation's attention, which was the OJ trials. Well, we remember from the OJ trials that he experienced a criminal case. He was brought forward and charged with murder of two individuals in a criminal courts. He was then found not guilty, innocent of those crimes, as there is a high burden of proof. And then we see later down the road, months or years later, I forget exactly when, he was charged in a civil case. In this civil case, he was then found guilty and tasked with providing monetary redistribution to the families that were harmed. So we see that represents the lower burden of proof, and how, although we have double jeopardy, an individual cannot be tried twice for the same crime, we can see that you can be tried once in a criminal court and once in a civil court. So what does our Constitution say about the judicial process? Remember briefly in the beginning of the course we discussed the impact that some pivotal moments like John Adams defending the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, and the impact that had on implementing the sentiment that we must have fair court procedures, not just for those we identify as American citizens, but for all individuals charged within courts. And I mentioned that because of the American citizens angle, because the British soldiers were not American citizens in the eyes of John Adams or any of the individuals, of course, as there was no state yet at the time. But we do understand that framing intended originating from John Adams. So, amendments guiding the judicial process. We have the Fourth Amendment. This amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure and requires probable cause and a warrant. This addresses the judicial process outside of the court system at large. You have the right to be protected against unreasonable search and seizure, as in there needs to be true probable cause, which can be challenged in courts. You must also this also requires warrants in certain circumstances, as you can remember and see from the movies, the moments of you must have a warrant to enter my home or car or whatever it may be. Continuing on, the Fifth Amendment. This is the one where, I always give the example that basically nobody understands, of the old Chappelle Show skit, I plead the Fifth, in which you have the ability to not self-incriminate yourself. You have the opportunity when in court, when asked a question, to say, I plead the Fifth and will not answer the question and self-incriminate myself. Beyond that aspect of the Fifth Amendment is a bit more expansive. It protects you from double jeopardy. You cannot, as I mentioned before, you cannot be tried for a crime twice. The state cannot say, you committed this murder, bring you to court, and then lose the court case, and then say, well, we're going to just keep trying. That is against the Fifth Amendment. The state has one chance to convict an individual of a specific crime. We also see right to due process provided by the Fifth Amendment. Continuing, the Sixth Amendment addresses fair, speedy trials, public trials with impartial juries, and a right to be informed of your charges and to confront witnesses, in addition to the right to counsel. You have the right to have an individual represent your case. You have the right to an accessible trial. We cannot have you in prison for extended periods of time. You have a right to a jury of your peers. And of course, you have to be informed of your charges. The foundation for, I think, Miranda rights, you were read when you were arrested. We see the confront witnesses, of course, a little nuance, but you have to be able to have individuals openly identify the crimes committed. Seventh Amendment, we see this is a right to a jury trial in federal cases as well as state cases, expanding the protections for individuals by both state and federal entities. This is important regarding the distinction between civil and criminal cases as well. We see the Eighth Amendment protects against excessive bail, excessive fines, and when it comes to the punishments brought forward by the courts, it ensures that you cannot have cruel and unusual punishment, or as some refer to, cruel or unusual punishment, showing the ability of specific interpretation and the nuance that that can bring when debating our Constitution. Excuse me. We also see the 14th Amendment. This expands due process protections and equal protection under law. So you think of the incorporation doctrine and how it grants courts the power to review state laws that may infringe upon individual rights. So we see the 14th Amendment, although very nuanced, provides a lot of foundational interpretation relied on today. And when we look at specific cases, we'll dive into the impact and specifics of our 14th Amendment later on. But for now, we will just briefly brush past it. So, judicial appointments. A little reminder here, but presidents make judicial appointments. This is the president's authority. But, of course, no presidential power goes unchecked, as we have Senate Judiciary Committees and the Senate at large debating appointments and voting on these appointments. Remember the debate. The Senate Judiciary Committees, when we think about that period after an election cycle, when you have individuals like RFK Jr. Testifying in front of Congress, answering specific questions. This is an example of the Senate Judiciary Committee's obligation to really, I guess you could simply put, grill the individuals that are appointed to the cabinet and judicial posts. Of course, RFK Jr. is an example of a cabinet member, not a judicial appointment. Now, when you look at judicial appointments, these are those circuit, district, or Supreme Court judges or justices. It's worth noting there are no qualifications for being a judge or Supreme Court justice, and these are one of the very few and only positions actually in the United States government that allows lifelong appointments, both for all federal judges and for the Supreme Court. Now, state judges, of course, have nuance and they vary based on state. So let's look at our current U.S. Supreme Court. Well, not our current, our U.S. Supreme Court throughout history. So looking at the body at large, we've seen 113 individuals have held posts as justices within our Supreme Court throughout the entirety of U.S. history. It's about a fifth of how many players there are in the NBA at any given moment. A very small selection of individuals, very American way of measuring that, by the way, a small selection of individuals to ever hold this post. And when we look at the Supreme Court, we know there are 9 Supreme Court justices that hold the post in any given time. This has been established since 1869, generally understood, but we know there's been a unique history with the amount of justices. Originally all appointed by George Washington, we see that in the 1700s, we see the court had 6 judges. 1801, remember after that Jefferson Revolution under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, the number increased to 7 to break ties, as it was identified as a notable detriment. And also, first Chief Justice ever, John Jay, although he only held the post for about 6 years and then resigned to become governor because at the time, a more influential role as a governor of New York. Different conversation. But 1803, we see it was reduced back to 6 Supreme Court justices. 1819, the court grew to 7 once again. 1837, we saw a brief increase to 9 justices, although roughly 30 years later, we saw this even reach 10 justices, but extremely short-lived. And a few years later, the number was set permanently to 9, where it has remained ever since. So we've hit that consistent odd number of 9 justices since 1869. So when we look at our justices today, we see our current Chief Justice, which is a position with a little bit more authority within the body, is John Roberts. We'll look at the role and responsibility of the Chief Justice in just a few slides. Now, when we look at the body at large, we note that they hear about 80 cases a year. They do not have enforcement powers directly, but they do have the reliance on a checks and balance system in which the executive and legislative branches will help ensure the enforcement of Supreme Court interpretations. We've seen rulings in the past, although extremely rarely. And the first time, really almost the first and last time this notably happened, was during Andrew Jackson's presidency, as he pushed against a Supreme Court ruling regarding immigration practices at the time, and as we know, the dark moment in U.S. history of the Trail of Tears. That was sparked by Andrew Jackson rejecting the rulings provided by the Supreme Court, and it shows that through precedent, we always rely on the rulings of the Supreme Court, although we have the physical moments in which it can be pushed back against. So we rely on checks and balances for the Supreme Court to have any ability to enforce their rulings. We know that our current Supreme Court consists of 3 justices appointed by Democratic presidents. I believe there's one Bill Clinton appointee, and a Barack Obama, and of course a Joe Biden remaining. We see also there are 6 justices appointed by Republican presidents. Donald Trump has appointed the most current Supreme Court justices at 3, and the others remaining from the Bush and other Bush eras. So we understand these 9 justices currently make up the current Supreme Court and have held these posts since they were appointed by whatever president appointed them, and will hold them until they resign or pass away, sadly, as we have had Supreme Court justices in recent years pass away while holding the office. So continuing on to look at this in more detail. What are the requirements to become a Supreme Court justice or a federal judge at all? We mentioned this before, but there are absolutely none. This does not require a law degree and does not maintain an age requirement of any kind. We see our Constitution says, quote, "The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges both of the Supreme and inferior courts shall hold their office during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their service a compensation which shall not be diminished during the continuance of in office." When we look at Supreme Court justices and the criteria utilized in the past to determine appointments, we can look at the individual who's appointed more, almost more justices than any other, and that is George Washington. I believe he actually has appointed more justices, although I know there are times in U.S. history where we have had up to 5 justices appointed by a single president. So the criteria utilized by Washington as he appointed the first round of justices was, did they support and advocate the U.S. Constitution? Simply, did they have a Federalist leaning during the Federalist-Anti-Federalist divide before there was true party lines? We also see, did they have distinguished service in the American Revolution? Very unique one that would be very hard to maintain to date. Do they have active participation in the political life of a particular state or the nation as a whole? Are they a part of the federal government or engaged in any state entities? Do they have prior judicial experience on lower tribunals? Do they have any experience as a lawyer, a judge of any kind? Do they have experience reading the law codes of any kind? Do they have either a favorable reputation with their fellows, or are they personally known to Washington himself? And of course, are they geographically suitable and near Washington, D.C. at the time? And of course, do they have love of country? So these are the requirements George Washington identified. I won't quiz you on it, but it's helpful in interpreting the way we viewed a Supreme Court justice at the time and the requirements or the threshold we maintained for them to be able to obtain this post. And of course, there are individuals that hold lifelong appointments. So when we look at these individuals, there's one important distinction to make. how are they going to interpret our Constitution? We do not appoint judges based on their preference for any partisan policies or presidential sentiments. Our Supreme Court justices are intended to be completely apolitical and maintain no ideological leanings. Of course, we do have humanity in these individuals, and we've seen, based on voting records, some ideological favoritisms within each individual. But we do know that the best way to identify a divide between certain justices is by identifying them as a originalist or a living constitutionalist. Now, this determines how they interpret the text of our Constitution and our statutory law. This is more influential than their sentiments of being conservative or liberal or whatever you may identify as their ideology. What does this mean? Well, an originalist is an individual, a Supreme Court justice, who would interpret the specific, and I mean very specific, text of our Constitution. We have, and of course this resides on a spectrum. You have hardline originalism and hardline living constitutionalism. Every Supreme Court justice resides somewhere along this spectrum, and none of them are at the extreme ends. So, an extreme originalist would look at our Eighth Amendment, in which we state no cruel and unusual punishment. Well, they would say you can have cruel or you can have unusual punishment. It just can't be both. Of course, we do not have Supreme Court justices making that argument, but that just shows one of the most clear examples of an extreme interpretation of originalism. And of course, they would say that because of the use of the word and instead of the use of the word or. So, a living constitutionalist, on the other hand, views the Constitution as a guiding document, but one that must evolve with each new threat. It evolves in response to changing circumstances and values. Now, a living constitutionalist, with that past example, would say, yes, we do have an amendment that says no cruel and unusual punishment, but we understand that examining cruel or unusual punishment is morally atrocious. And our Constitution, although it used the word end, it most likely intended or allows for us to use the word or in interpreting it. So a living constitutionalist would say you can't have cruel punishment, even if it's not unusual. An originalist would say you can have cruel punishment as long as it's not unusual. Extreme examples of the difference in interpretation. Now let's look at a case from early 2000s. I will fly through this as quick as possible with a little bit of oversimplification, but it is worth using this as an example of how to understand this difference in actual practice. So, District of Columbia versus Heller was a ruling in which, again, I'm going to try and be brief about this, but we had a police officer who had a private weapon, and in Washington, D.C., there was an extreme level of gun violence, and one of the solutions at the city level was to restrict private gun ownership, and I believe it was concealed carry within Washington, D.C. And something occurred with this police officer while he was off duty, in which he, I believe, had to discharge the weapon. Again, this is not a specific case study of this course, so we're just briefly covering this, and I'm covering a lot of this conversational aspect off the top of my memory. And this brought him to the court system. And in the courts, this police officer argued that it is his Second Amendment right to have a firearm as a citizen beyond a on-duty police officer. So his argument was that he can be armed. And District of Columbia, that represents the Heller side, District of Columbia was stating that due to local gun regulations, it is illegal for him to possess this firearm. So an originalist examining this case would use the 1800 text to defend the identified original intent behind a well-regulated militia. So an originalist would say, well, we do have a Second Amendment right to bear arms, but of course, a dimension of this amendment is that it must be a well-regulated militia. And when you look at local counties, especially early on in U.S. history, it was the local county which was in charge of ensuring a militia was present and that it was well regulated on some level. That's a lot of the foundations that would be interpreted using an originalist interpretation, although a living constitutionalist would identify a different position. This is well represented through the dissenting position provided by Justice John Paul Stevens, in which he aligned with a more living constitutional approach and argued that the Second Amendment should be understood in the context of modern societal needs. And he believed that the original purpose of the amendment was to ensure state militias could defend against federal overreach, not to protect as an individual's right to own firearms unrelated to military service, and argued that we need to have this amendment interpreted differently because of the different environment we are in today. And we see a lot of living constitutionalists focusing on the development of contemporary societal issues revolving around gun violence instead of the Constitution's original intention revolving around the Second Amendment. So we see an originalist would dive into the text of our Second Amendment and explore the interpretations of the time and the incentives present for those individuals, while a living constitutionalist would focus more so on contemporary gun violence and data trends in recent news. Now, we have originalists and living constitutionalists running our Supreme Court currently, and it is the frequent engagement with opposing viewpoints that results in our Supreme Court finding conclusions that generally are supported by the general population. So let's look at our contemporary Supreme Court. Now, I see the title, the Conservative Supreme Court, and why is that there? I just mentioned that our Supreme Court needs to be void of any ideological leanings, and that it is better to view originalism or living constitutionalism than liberal or conservative, which is all very true. But we do have to acknowledge that when you look at voting records, just like roll call voting in Congress, and how we measure polarization through that data point, we see that we can see voting trends within our current Supreme Court, and they align with some ideological leanings, although it is very important to note that there is no partisan blind leniency within our Supreme Court, and we do have more so ideological approaches to government guiding these differences than affiliations and leniencies and reliance on any individual presidential appointment. So 6 of the 9, and I only include this slide because our textbook makes this a very important note, and it does so because it helps identify trends within our Supreme Court. In the 1970s, we had a liberal-leaning Supreme Court, which implemented a lot of rulings, which in 2021 and 22 specifically were overturned by our conservative-leaning Supreme Court as we measure it based on roll call voting. So when we look at our Supreme Court, we remember Chief Justice John Roberts, who was appointed by George W. Bush in 2005. And he often plays a central role in balancing the court's conservative and liberal wings and represents a more of a originalist approach to interpreting our Constitution. But it is very important to note there are frequent times when he breaks with the general sentiments of the other 5 conservative-leaning justices and has, at various points in U.S. history, acted as a strong, moderate voice among our Supreme Court, and other times aligning with the conservative side of the Supreme Court. We know as well Justice Clarence Thomas, the longest-serving justice, appointed in 91 by the first George H.W. Bush, and he is what he is referred to as a strong originalist, oftentimes relying very heavily on those interpretations of our Constitution and a very strict interpretation of our Constitution. We also see Justice Samuel Alito. He is one of the representatives that is more of a staunch conservative, as many have identified through his voting records as well, appointed in 2006 by President George W. Bush. Now we can see the 3 Donald Trump appointed justices. Justice Neil Gorsuch, appointed by Donald Trump in 2017, his first of the 3 appointments. And he's known for having a very textualist approach to the Constitution. So, originalist with a little more nuance, moving a little bit closer to the living constitutionalist on that spectrum. And we see Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh joined the court in 2018, only a year after Gorsuch, and appointed by Trump, as we know, and played a key role in some profile cases since. and has been a notable vote along those conservative lines in recent years. This was the individual who was appointed in, well, we'll just say that for a later date. There's another segment I can cover that. We also see Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the newest member up until recently. Barrett was appointed by Trump in 2020, cementing a generally conservative supermajority, as she does tend to vote along those lines, as we've seen in recent years. Now, looking at the three Democratic appointed Supreme Court justices, we see the most recent appointee, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, appointed by Joe Biden in 2022. She made history as the first Black woman to serve on the court, and does align generally with a liberal leaning and a living constitutionalist approach to constitutional interpretations. We see Justice Sonia Sotomayor, appointed by Barack Obama in 2009. Sonia Sotomayor is the first Latina on the court and is often seen as a voice for progressivism and viewed as a starched living constitutionalist. And finally, Justice Elena Kagan, another Barack Obama appointee, joined the court in 2010. And before she became a justice, she was actually the Solicitor General of the United States, which is a position tasked with representing the U.S. government in Supreme Court cases. So she had a lot of engagement prior and probably felt quite comfortable within the Supreme Court, as she had tried numerous cases in front of previous Supreme Courts. We have had two presidents in U.S. history, actually. I mentioned prior that about Washington, but two presidents have actually appointed 8 justices, both Roosevelt and Washington. And we see Eisenhower, Lincoln, Harrison appointed 4, and we have had many presidents to appoint 3, but most recently we see Ronald Reagan, Nixon, Truman, and of course Donald Trump. So 3 appointees by a single president, not that uncommon. We've actually had far more. These ideological tendencies and leniencies, they're present, although not blatant and not predictable in all hearings. So we do see these lines being broken somewhat frequently, although there is a greater tendency to vote along these identified lines than we have had a predictable voting tendency in the past Supreme Courts. Now, which cases reach the Supreme Court? This is where we realize the power and influence of the Chief Justice, our boy John Roberts. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has the absolute power to determine which cases are to be heard by the Supreme Court. We have, of course, 80 cases a year, so that's 80 moments of decision making in which the Chief Justice has notable influence to determine what they are going to be discussing and providing rulings on. You see some examples, especially in recent months with, I believe there were some trade rulings, some immigration rulings, and some rulings on the interpretation of the constitutionality of certain executive orders, like the one changing our interpretation of citizenship in the United States. We see all of these cases have been fast-tracked to the Supreme Court, but they rely on the Chief Justice agreeing to hear them, although even if the president encourages or discourages the case from reaching the court. So what are landmark rulings? Landmark rulings are pretty simple to understand. They're rulings that substantially change the interpretation of existing laws. One second, I'm a little sick. Sorry. I would re-record this, but it's too late to turn around. So a landmark ruling oftentimes establishes a standard or a test that can be utilized in lower courts. We're going to look at a couple landmark rulings, some of which were overturned, some of which we still rely on. But it helps exemplify how they create a standard for interpreting the legality of certain legislation, or they create a test, like the Lemon test, which determines the constitutionality of certain state actions. So landmark rulings can be overturned as well, and they are overturned by the providing of another, newer landmark ruling. So it is the most recent and highest court's interpretation of law that is what is utilized to enforce legislation. So where we get into the weeds. We're going to explore a handful of landmark rulings and whether they were overturned or not, and primarily not the politics side of this, the government side of this. What are the foundations relied upon when our Supreme Court justices were providing their rulings? So let's look at the most inflammatory, often, Roe v. Wade. So, Roe v. Wade addresses the issue of reproductive rights. This is where the rulings provided in the 1970s were founded off of the 14th Amendment and the sentimental right to privacy. The U.S. Constitution, in the argument for the ruling provided in the 1970s regarding Roe v. Wade, argued that there was a fundamental right to privacy that protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose whether to have an abortion, relying on the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. This is where we see our 14th Amendment states, no state shall make or enforce any laws which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of liberty, life, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person without its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So we see this acted as the foundation for the ruling provided in the 70s, not actually relying on the specific amendment of the 14th Amendment. They attempted to provide federal protections of privacy and healthcare to individuals throughout the entirety of the United States, and we see this ruling focuses on the protection of liberty under the Due Process Clause and the liberty of the individuals to determine their own bodily autonomy. Of course, these are the foundations of the ruling provided in the 1970s, which implemented the legislation that was in existence until 2022. In 2022, we see the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the landmark ruling provided in the 70s. This is where we can see the liberal-leaning 1970 Supreme Court and the conservative-leaning 2020 Supreme Court. So the ruling in which Roe v. Wade was overturned was Dobbs v. Jackson. And the foundations provided in the ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson in 2022 stated that the Constitution of the United States does not confer a specific right to privacy of the body. We see abortion is currently a states' rights issue in response to this in response to this landmark ruling. So it is then the responsibility of the legislature to determine how these practices are put forward. Now that the federal legislature has stepped away due to this ruling, we see the state legislature stepping in and providing nuanced interpretations of this ruling that vary state by state. And we saw it after 2022, those midterm elections brought forward a lot of ballot referendums, and we saw that again in 2024, in which we had the opportunity to vote on legislation to be enforced or implemented by Congress regarding this issue. So one way that Roe v. Wade represents landmark rulings is it shows that landmark rulings can be overturned, and the impact that comes when one is overturned often comes in the state legislatures. So we see a rapid buildup of state policy making in response to this moment in U.S. history. We see that the argument stating that there is no privacy clause in the Constitution was what is currently guiding our legislation on this issue. But when we look at the ruling in Roe v. Wade in the 1970s, there were additional sentiments beyond the 14th Amendment, as there were arguments that the First Amendment addresses the right to privacy of belief and privacy of group membership. Third has a right to privacy of the home. Remember the Housing and Soldiers Amendment. Fourth Amendment has protections against unreasonable searches, right to be secure in their person's house's papers and effects, which has some interpretations relating to these circumstances as they reference the persons. Fifth Amendment has a right to privacy and personal thought and documents, oftentimes as a foundation to medical privacy laws. We see the Ninth Amendment has a protection of rights not granted in the Constitution to be left up to the state and the people, including a right to privacy, which is why we see a lot of the legislation revolving around this issue occurring on the state level, relying on that Ninth Amendment. 14th Amendment, 14th protection and privacy of personal freedoms, as we previously mentioned. Due process clause protects certain fundamental rights, including privacy from government interference, particularly through the doctrine of substantive due process. So beyond bodily autonomy and women's reproductive rights, the due process clause has been a foundation for interpretation regarding granting individuals privacy and protections from government interference. Now, if we had more time, and if you're interested, there are a lot other lower court cases and previous Supreme Court cases that laid the foundations relied upon within Roe v. Wade and the later Dobbs v. Jackson that are influential in interpreting the progression of history regarding these issues. As these issues are not black and white, they do not provide a single moment we need to examine, instead a story that we must tell and understand and give credit and constitutional foundations to both sides in order to respectfully debate the issue at hand. Now, let's continue on and look at another landmark ruling. Another landmark ruling that has actually been overturned in the year 2022. So, this ruling is Lemon v. Kurtzman. This originally challenged a Rhode Island statute that provided salary supplements to private schools. Now, these private schools were 95% Catholic schools in the northeast of the United States. So, the teachers receiving these supplements were teaching Catholic education in Catholic schools, which directly broke at the time our rule of separation of church and state, as we were not only allowing for the connection between the church and state, but funding of religious institutions of education. So Lemon v. Kurtzman was a ruling provided by the 70s to push back against this overwhelming funding of Catholic schools and addresses the separation of church and state by providing clear standards. 1970s, Lemon v. Kurtzman provided the Lemon test. There are 3 questions that the state must ask and answer when determining if the Lemon test will allow certain legislation. So first, does any law, so you're proposing a law, you have to make it through the Lemon test. Does it have a secular purpose? If it has a secular purpose, okay, continue on. It's not just intended for religious guidance. 2, does the law's primary purpose inhibit any other religions? So if you have one law that might benefit a specific religion, does it inhibit other religions and the right to practice those religions? And 3, does this represent some level of excessive entanglement with religion? So if you fail those 3 questions, I guess you could say, and result in excessive entanglement between the church and state, according to the Lemon test, the courts should restrict the legislation from going into effect. Now, this Lemon test was in effect from the 1970s up until 2022, when we saw the court case heard by the Supreme Court in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, in which they overturned the Lemon test and provided a new landmark ruling regarding this issue. Our Supreme Court stated, the majority ruling stated, history tradition determines the scope of constitutional rights, breaking with a generally originalist interpretation led by the 6 individuals in 2022, 6 Supreme Court justices at the time. So we see both ideological and living constitutionalist and originalist guidance ebbing and flowing with specific cases, and neither being a true predictor of how our Supreme Court will provide specific rulings. But when we look at this, I also want to tell you the story of Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, so we understand what happened for the court to say history tradition determines the scope of constitutional rights. So first, and of course, overturn the Lemon test. So in Kennedy versus Bremerton, there was a high school football coach. This football coach, before and after every game, would go out to midfield, and he would kneel and pray. And some parents were not in support of this action. So this eventually reached the Supreme Court. And without the whole story of it all, one of the general arguments in this case was that as a representative of the school, he should not be directly affiliating with a single religion, as it may encourage others or whatever it may be. So, and using the Lemon test, does his actions have a secular purpose? Not necessarily, as it is an action of prayer. Does it inhibit other religions? Some would argue it may, as others might not pray in the exact same way or to the same religion. And does it represent excessive entanglement? And the Lemon test would say that it does, as he represents the school as a working teacher and should not be entangled with religious affiliations at that time. Now, the Kennedy versus Bremerton School District identified his actions as constitutional and basically states that the Lemon test does not hold up in this specific case, as he is acting under his First Amendment rights to free affiliation and assembly and expression of religion And this actually overturned the Lemon Test and made it to where it no longer is a tool utilized in lower courts. And again, if you're interested, I am more than able to give you a actual detailed back and forth story of that in case, and also for the case regarding Roe v. Wade and Dobbs v. Jackson. Now, let's talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, another landmark ruling which has been overturned, although not as recently. So, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 was a Supreme Court case in which we had an individual by the name of Plessy, who identified that the railway, I believe the exact language of the legislation is the Separate Car Act of 1890, in which we had the legal segregation of passengers on railway carts when they travel on trains in the United States. So this was, of course, segregation at its peak. And an individual, Homer Plessy, identified that, well, we have a constitutional right to these resources, and if we get to the Supreme Court, we will win. So Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black and at the time was referred to as passing white, he notified the railway companies that he was a black individual who will be sitting in the white section, purposefully acting as a protest against the policies, purposefully arrested, and then eventually brought this case to the Supreme Court, in which they argued that this is not constitutional. But our Supreme Court determined that the segregation within the railway carts was constitutional, as they stated the infamous line, which states separate but equal. We see there was a 7-1 ruling, as we only had 8 justices at the time, as due to a passing away of a justice. The one justice who did rule against the Plessy versus Ferguson majority ruling, John Marshall Harlan, stated, quote, "The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country," and, quote, and later referred to the Constitution as colorblind, arguing against this legislation. So we see Plessy v. Ferguson determined that segregation is protected under the U.S. Constitution for the next 59 years. This will be in effect until 1964, in which we have the Civil Rights Act, founded off of a landmark ruling provided in Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned the rulings of Plessy v. Ferguson. So, one aspect I always point out here, segregation ended 59 years ago. Well, now it's 61 years ago. I never update that dimension of the slide because, well, I'll update it every 5 years. But we do know segregation was protected for even longer, for the 70 years prior, starting in 1896. This landmark ruling provided the constitutional foundations of Jim Crow legislation, which would strike the South for years to come, and not to be overturned until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, in which we determined separate but not equal is not equal. So, Brown v. Board of Education, since we're already reaching about an hour, I'm going to skip an overview on that ruling, although we do know from high school history the importance and impact of Brown v. Board of Education, as it made segregation unconstitutional and provided the roadmap for desegregating our education systems, predominantly in the South, although there was notable pushback by individuals like George Wallace. But that's a discussion for another day when we talk about third-party candidates. So, the final landmark ruling to be examined in this class is one bit more recent, and one that has not been overturned. The only landmark ruling in this course examined that has not been overturned. So, what is Obergefell versus Hodges? This is a ruling provided in 2015, a landmark decision provided by the Supreme Court, which ruled that the fundamental right to marriage is guaranteed to all same-sex couples. This relates to our later lecture on civil rights and civil liberties, and continues the discussion about the implementation and reliance on the 14th Amendment and precisely its due process clause and equal protection clause. And I think it's notable as it helps illustrate how recent these developments are regarding our judicial system and the rulings that provided the foundations we rely on today regarding civil liberties and civil rights. So this Obergefell versus Hodges decision was a 5-4 decision in support of providing a fundamental right to marriage in all states. This expanded the rights and access to marriage in numerous states, which was previously restricted. Obergefell versus Hodges is a scenario where I forget the exact name. I think it was something Obergefell. It was a man who was married to another man in a state in the Northeast. The state they lived did not have legal same-sex marriage, so they had to go to a different state to get their marriage license. When they returned to their home state, a few years later, his husband passed away due to illness. And on the death records, he noticed that his husband's death records identified him as single and unmarried, and this did not sit well with Obergefell. Obergefell brought this case forward to the courts, arguing for the legal right for his marriage to be recognized on his deceased husband's death records. They were determined to be legally and constitutionally married, and this ruling provided the fundamental right to marriage to all individuals in the United States, expanding beyond same-sex regarding same-sex marriages, in addition to marriages regarding certain abilities in certain regions of the country as well, directly providing a lot of protections for individuals regarding the marriage process. So, and this is one where I will offer the opportunity to dive into in detail with me one-on-one over Zoom, as this is a very nuanced Supreme Court ruling, and it's very fascinating. It helps us understand the private gun ownership debates, and through a more constitutional framework that helps us dive more into the founders' intents behind our amendments and how we rely on these amendments in modern interpretation. No Supreme Court issue beyond that Eighth Amendment example better illustrates the divide between originalists and living constitutionalists, those who rely on the intentions of our founding fathers and those who rely on contemporary threats that our guiding documents might be able to help us address. So, again, reveals the divide between living constitutionalists and originalists. The foundation of this amendment, this ruling, is based off of the Second Amendment, which in its entirety states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, and the right of the person to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, revealing a lot of nuance in how it's interpreted regarding the intentions of our founding fathers, regarding them focusing on state militias or individual rights to bear arms, and this directly challenges that interpretation and reveals the divide among interpreting our Constitution. And there are prior cases, just like I mentioned regarding Roe v. Wade, that had laid the groundwork for this ruling in District of Columbia versus Heller. Think of U.S. versus Miller, 1939 ruling. We also have various legislation, the National Firearms Act of 1934, Gun Control Act of 1968, which we've expanded or restricted gun rights, individual gun ownership laws within the United States. And if you are interested, I strongly encourage you to reach out and we can have a Zoom meeting in which we discuss this, or research it on your own. Apologies. There are some great videos on YouTube that'll break down, take the 3-minute videos, that'll break down the overarching objective details of it, and then I would happily work with you to dive into the more nuanced arguments within that, as that can be a bit more difficult in finding adequate information online, and not information that presents one side of the argument over the other, but instead an objective analysis that is primarily empirical and dismisses normative claims. So I'd love to debate these issues with you, not really debate, but discuss. So reach out anytime if you're curious, but it is worth noting there's no need to remember anything regarding this case, and you will not be quizzed upon it. Although, if you are struggling to understand originalism and living constitutionalism, this is the roadmap to understanding that. having a discussion with me about this case. Now, what are the checks the two branches have on our judicial? So let's start with the executive. What can the executive do? For one, they can appoint the judges that work within the judicial branch, having direct influence on who makes up the body at large. We also see the president can grant pardons, reprieves, and commutations, overturning the rulings provided in the lower courts, oftentimes rarely ever pushing back against Supreme Court rulings. We see these primarily regarding federal criminal cases, oftentimes overturning district rulings. We see individuals charged for crimes like, given life sentences for distribution of drugs being pardoned. We've seen individuals with certain connections to other individuals being pardoned. Sometimes if you know the president, that's beneficial to being pardoned by the president. We've also seen in recent months, one of the most notable pardons, I won't even mention. We've seen pardons, reprieves, and commutations in recent months, and in the months prior, as you see, presidents, almost every president, provides pardons, reprieves, commutations as they leave office in their last year, in last months in particular. So, and what can the legislative do to act as a check on the judicial? For one, they can approve the judges appointed by the president, a significant influence, oftentimes rejecting many of the appointments made by presidents, and as we remember during the Barack Obama era of filibustering judicial appointments, significantly delaying the ability of presidents to make appointments to the federal bodies. We also see they have the responsibility of drafting the legislation that the courts interpret, oftentimes really significantly guiding the judges and justices through their interpretation process with certain legislation. We also see they determine the number of judges on the Supreme Court. We've been consistent with this since the 1860s, but it is worth noting this power is granted to Congress via our Constitution. And that impeachment process we mentioned before, it also holds for judges and justices. We can impeach any federal judge or justice. Here are a lot of the bullet points we got to remember, a lot to take in, but a lot of this is review and stuff that you knew prior, just like the 3 lectures on the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So here are those answers. Take your quiz. It's due by Sunday at 11:59. And make sure you go through your discussions, traditional as always, your readings. We're catching a rhythm with this course, so I hope you understand your expectations. Next week, our midterm is due. That first page of our essay. I will post within the lecture on political parties excerpt on how I recommend you write your paper, and I strongly suggest up until then you gather resources, citations, and figure out how you're going to craft your argument. And then on Monday, watch the lecture, and throughout the week, view it as an assignment. It's a 1-page essay. You can do it in a week, and it will be a lot easier to do so after you get some guiding comments from me in the lecture. So, but I don't want to distract you with that this week. Focus on your quiz, get those discussions in, make sure you're caught up with the content in the course, and reach out with any questions. Thank you for bearing with me as I give you this sniffly, congested, sick lecture here. Have a good week, guys. I hope I hear from you via email.